and welcome to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I am Ladi Akari-Duluale. The headlines. UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres hails progress in talks over Ukraine grain exports. France nods to Ukraine in Bastille Day military parade. And North Korea officially recognizes independence of Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics in Ukraine. We begin this morning with what may in fact be good news on the four-way talks on grain exports to world markets amongst Turkey, Russia, Ukraine, and the United Nations in Istanbul. The UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, hailed what he called substantive progress in ensuring the export of Ukrainian food products through the Black Sea. He told reporters at the UN headquarters in New York that a critical step forward was made to ensure the safe and secure export of Ukrainian food products through the Black Sea. He said more technical work will be needed to materialize the progress, but the momentum is clear.
We have seen a critical step forward to ensuring the safe and secure export of Ukrainian food products through the Black Sea. In a world darkened by global crisis, today at last we have a ray of hope. I traveled to Moscow and Kyiv to propose solutions for both problems. Every day since, we have been working around the clock with intense behind-the-scenes talks with countless moving parts. More technical work will now be needed to materialize today's progress, but the momentum is clear. In the end, the aim of all parties is not just an agreement between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, but an agreement for the world. People are still dying, fighting is still raging. But hopeful news from Istanbul shows the importance of dialogue. Let us take inspiration from that ray of hope to help light a way to a desperately needed negotiated solution for peace in line with UN Charter and international law. There was a substantive agreement on many aspects, namely the questions related to the mechanisms of control, related to the system of coordination, and relating to the questions of the mining, in relation to many of the concrete, I would say, substantive aspects. But of course, this was a first meeting. The progress was extremely encouraging. We hope that now the delegations are coming back to their capitals, and we hope that the next steps will allow us to come to a formal agreement. I never like to make predictions because the predictions usually are never respected. We are hoping that we'll be able to reconvene very soon, I'm sure next week, and hopefully we'll be able to have a final agreement. But, as I said, we still need a lot of goodwill and commitment by all parties. They have shown it. I'm encouraged, I'm optimistic, but it's not yet fully done. I think we cannot overestimate the importance of this agreement. This agreement is an extremely relevant step in relation to addressing the food crisis, together with the efforts we have been making in relation to the access of Russian food and fertilizers to the global markets. But I do not see immediately the perspective of a peace agreement. I think, in any case, this demonstrated that the parties are able to have a constructive dialogue, and this is, of course, very good news. But for peace, we still have a long way to go.
The UN chief's stance was reiterated by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, who said in a video message that there was progress on an agreement to resume grain exports blocked by Russia. It raised hopes of an end to a standoff that has exposed millions to the risk of starvation, according to President Zelensky. More than 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain are stocked in silos at the Black Sea port of Odessa, and dozens of ships have been stranded due to Russia's blockade, part of what Moscow calls its special military operation in Ukraine, but which Kiev and the West say is an unjustified war of aggression.
There are many mentions in the news today about a meeting in Turkey regarding the unblocking of our country's agricultural exports through the Black Sea. We are indeed putting a significant effort into resuming the supply of food to the world market, and I am grateful to the United Nations and Turkey for their respective efforts. The success of this story is necessary not only for our state, but without exaggeration for the whole world. If the Russian threat to navigation in the Black Sea can be removed, it will alleviate the global food crisis. The Ukrainian delegation has reported to me that there is progress. In the coming days, we will agree on the details with the UN Secretary General. Also today, representatives of the occupation authorities in Donetsk claimed that they had been recognized by the DPRK. As they say, of course, will respond very harshly at all levels. But this is such news that it does not even need any further comment. Everything is obvious. What path we are on and where the occupiers may be leading to. Debris removal after the Russian strike on the city of Chasiv Yar continues. At the moment, the list of dead includes 48 people, one child among them. The number of rescued, unfortunately, has not changed, just 9 people. Rescuers will continue working on the site until all rubble is cleared. This was one of the most brutal Russian strikes during the entire war. So many victims. My condolences to their families and friends.
And Turkey went one step further by announcing a deal with Ukraine, Russia, and the United Nations aimed at resuming Ukrainian grain exports blocked by Russia, raising prospects for an end to a standoff that has exposed millions to the risk of starvation. Its Defense Minister, Hulusi Akar, said an agreement would be signed next week when all parties on the grain talks meet again, adding that the parties had agreed on joint controls for checking grains at harbors. Let's talk now to Executive Director of Pekavi Consulting Limited. Chidi Wanu joins us live from the British capital, London. Good morning to you, Chidi. Nice to have you this morning.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
This is good news, isn't it? When you and I spoke about this a couple of days ago, you weren't very optimistic, but it does appear as if somehow both sides and the interlocutors have dug deep and come up with some sort of agreement.
It would appear so, but the devil is, as usual, in the detail and in the execution. So it's in the interest of every side to come to some sort of an agreement with this, particularly Ukraine, but also for Russia. Russia cannot be seen to be the intransigent party. It can't be seen to be the party that's contributing to global starvation. So it is, from the Russian side, they want to be able to say all of the problems are due to Western sanctions and to Ukrainian blockages. Whilst for the Ukrainians, they want to be able to point to the Russians and say, this is due to Russian aggression and Russians preventing us from exporting our grain, stealing our grain, etc. And then there's operational problems in that practically the Black Sea approaches to Ukraine's ports are mined, and there's a Russian naval blockade. So when you put all of these factors in together, every side has a reason to kind of try and advance their position as far as possible, but every side also needs to find a way out, as I said, because neither side wants to be responsible. So the Turks obviously have an incentive as the guarantors of access to Black Sea, and the UN obviously acting in its capacity as the UN is looking to facilitate this. So it looks positive, but until those ships start sailing, we really shouldn't count on anything.
Now, you referenced that in the answer to the last question when you talked about the Turks. It does seem as if they have stepped up to the plate here. Recep Tayyip Erdogan stepped up to the plate here, and where virtually everybody else couldn't or wouldn't, he's done that. And with some level, I understand the risk factors that you've talked about the devil being in the details. Of course, we had this kind of progress with the substantive peace talks themselves before everything fell apart. So, you know, there's need for caution. But why do you think the Turks have been the ones at the center of all of this and not any of the other traditional powers or those that were initially thought to have been the ones with leverage on both sides?
So yeah, that's a brilliant question, and interestingly, this is the same question or the same kind of discussion I had, you know, at another meeting I was having about this, about the role of Turkey. Turkey occupies a very unique position in not just Europe and Asia, but in this conflict. The Turks and the Russians have a long history of conflict from the days of the Ottoman Empire all the way to recently in Syria. The Turks and the what used to be the Russian Empire fought, you know, quite a lot over, you know, what's currently parts of Ukraine, what's the Caucasus, all of these, what's parts of Iran. They've been fighting for centuries, so they know each other. That's the most important thing. They know each other. They understand each other. They understand each other's psychologies very, very well at an institutional and a personal level. You will note that back in Syria, the Turks shot down a Russian plane that, you know, flew into their territory very briefly. Everyone expected a huge response from the Russians and nothing happens. This is because, again, the Turks understand the Russian psychology and the Russians understand the Turkish psychology. For the Turks, shooting down that plane was a warning to Russia that this is our line, do not cross it. The Russians understood, they got the message, and both sides carried on in whatever way they could. So I mean, I'm just trying to make this point to kind of emphasize that there is a psychological element in that these are parties that can talk to each other. They don't like each other, they don't trust each other, they're both competitors and they're both rivals, but they fundamentally understand each other. The other important point is that Turkey is a member of NATO. It is ostensibly a Western power. It's the second most powerful army in NATO. It has a huge land army, combat experience, and a very good military industry. That part, the part about the military industry, is again important because Turkey supplies weapons to both sides. It's one of the key weapon suppliers for Ukraine, supplying the very famous Bayraktar drone. This drone was used again against Russian-supported forces in Syria and in Libya, and used successfully, and has been used successfully by the Ukrainians in Ukraine. Now, again, this is important to understand that this is Turkey, who is talking to both sides, supplying weapons to one side, is in a conflict with one of the parties in Syria and Libya, as in Russia, but is still able to sit at the center of the table and get everyone around together. And the final big point about Turkey is that it's the guarantor of access to the Black Sea. So even though Russia could ostensibly try and force their way through the Black Sea, they will be getting into a war with a party who, as I explained before, they understand very well, is militarily powerful, and they can't push them over. So Turkey, of all the powers in this conflict, is the only country that can physically talk to the Russians, and the Russians will know them and understand them and respect them, and talk to the Ukrainians will understand them and respect them, get them on the table and get them to agree. So Turkey holds a very unique position in this conflict, and the role of the Turks is something that really needs to be watched for the, in the next phases of this conflict.
Ukraine as one of the parties of all of this, I mean, moving away now from this grain exports deal, Ukraine as one of the parties here appears to be at, I don't know if you want to call it a weaker point now, because in some of its allies, some of those who have stepped forward to back it to the hilt, there is some level of political instability, and there are fights for the political leadership in some of those places, and there will be fights in the coming months. And some of those countries are not too, shall we say, enamored of what this has brought to them, particularly economically. Let's take where you are in Britain there. Britain is going through a leadership change at the moment. One could almost say this war in Ukraine hastened what might have ultimately happened with Boris Johnson and his prime ministership. But the Ukrainians are worried, and we're having reports about that whoever is going to emerge as Boris Johnson's successor may not loom large over the war in Ukraine the way he did. He went to Kiev twice, probably the only Western leader who's done that in the last couple of months. But whoever is coming next may not be front and center like that. Do you share those concerns?
Not really, no, because I think particularly for the United Kingdom, support for Ukraine is bipartisan. The United Kingdom doesn't have the same kind of political problems that America has, where it's completely dysfunctional. There is complete bipartisan support here for Ukraine. Within the Conservative Party, who produce the next prime minister, there is universal support for the war in Ukraine, and there is nobody who is going to take power, who is going to draw down on support for Ukraine or compromise with Russia. It will be political suicide. So from the British point of view, that's not really a worry. Maybe the countries that you should look at that are a little bit worrying are, as I said, America, Italy, France, Germany. These are the biggest economies in the world. Of the other three, France, Germany, Italy, biggest economies in Europe, and they all have deep internal political problems. So Macron has won his presidency but lost parliament. America has a midterms with Joe Biden, who's deeply unpopular, and within the Republicans, there's a strong strain of anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian thought, which can influence the elections. And within Italy, there is a strong dependence on Russian gas, which is going to be problematic. And with the Germans, you've had Angela Merkel step down, a new chancellor faced with a conflict. He has to remilitarize Russia along Germany, and at the same time, he needs to find a replacement for Russian gas. The important factor is this winter. This winter will be the decisive point, because this winter will be the first winter of this war where Russia will be able to use its gas to force Europeans to take a position. It will be able to turn it off, turn it on, however it wants. And that will have a massive effect on Europe. You will see industries having to shut down, people freezing, huge price rises, a massive economic effect. If Europe can weather this winter, then that is the last time Russia will be able to play this card, because after this winter, Europe would have replaced Russian gas supplies. Prices might still be high, but the gas will be there. That's the important point. So this winter is the decision point, and that is where you will see the worry, in that whether Europeans can hold their nerve through this winter and the economic problems that are going to come. And for the Ukrainians, this is why you see now the Ukrainians are trying to force some sort of a battlefield decision, particularly in the south, particularly around Kherson, so that they can point to that when they're discussing with the Europeans and say, look, we're winning, we're getting somewhere, even though they're not winning right now. And you need to keep supporting us, and we'll get to the end of this. So, as I said, everything leads up to this winter.
Let's take that last point you made, even as we wind down the discussion. Let's take that last point you made, which is, are they winning, are they not? Now, that brings us to the military position. It's all but certain that Russia is going to take Donetsk. And what we do not know is whether they'll take it ahead of winter or it will happen much more slowly. Now, if that happens, Ukraine's military position becomes a bit more difficult. Is that correct?
Again, sorry, my answer is always yes or no, but yes and no, because losing, if we're going to be very brutal about this, the Donbass, Luhansk and Donetsk, they're important in terms of agriculture, industry, and mining and several other things. But for the past few years, since 2014, except for the agriculture parts, they've been generally economically unviable because of the war, because of Russian influence. So if the Ukrainians lose the east, psychologically, it's bad. But militarily, it is not that bad. As long as they hold the banks of the Dnieper River, they still have a natural defense for the rest of Ukraine. And as I said, for me and from some other analysts, the key battles are the battles of the south. As long as Ukraine doesn't have control of the Black Sea coast, it's economically unviable. It cannot export, it cannot import. It is essentially a landlocked country at the mercy of Russia. So that's where, for Ukraine, the decisive battle is to win the battle of the south. Everything that's happening in the east from a Ukrainian point of view is a holding action. It's to force the Russians to keep fighting there, although the Russians want to fight there because the Russians psychologically need to capture the Donbass, as that is what they started the war for. But for the Ukrainians, even if they lose the Donbass, they can hold on the Dnieper River and then counterattack at any point they want in the future. But if they lose the south over this winter, next winter, over the next planting season, then their economy is moribund. So whilst it is a bad situation right now for the Ukrainians, they are losing ground. they're not losing ground as quickly as they could, and they are making the Russians pay for every kilometer they capture really, really seriously. They're losing a lot of men, a lot of vehicles, consuming a lot of artillery shells and a lot of fuel. All of this Russia needs to replace, which will cost money, and the manpower is not there. So the Ukrainians are in a bad position, but it's all links in. If the Ukrainians can, win a small or 2 or 3 victories in the south, hold in the east, or just not lose too badly in the east, and Europe could make it to next winter, then the trajectory of the war changes in Ukraine's favor quite dramatically.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Chidi Warner, as always, for your perspective and for your time. To have a great day ahead.
Thanks for having me.
After the break, Hungary issues state of danger over energy crisis. Please join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Paris' traditional Bastille Day military parade today is a salute to Ukraine and to France's Eastern European allies who are amongst guests of honor. An official in Emmanuel Macron's office, said the parade is marked by and takes account of the strategic context. The idea is to highlight the strategic solidarity with our allies. Almost 5 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, the parade on the Champs-Élysées will open with the presentation of the national flags of 9 allied guest countries, most of them neighbors of Ukraine or Russia, including Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. Troops representing France's contingent on NATO's eastern flank will be next. Paris expedited the deployment of 500 soldiers to Romania days after the Russian attack on Ukraine and has signaled its readiness to boost numbers if needed. Meanwhile, French President Emmanuel Macron has encouraged troops to maintain their, quote, moral strength in the face of a conflict at Europe's doorstep. War is returning fully and cruelly to European soil, and it reminds us of the tragedies of history, he said during a traditional address to military personnel ahead of today. Mr. Macron said the government aims to fulfill its commitment as part of a military budget law that is projected to allot 50 billion euros for the military by 2025 amidst the Ukraine war. The president also said more investment will be needed for defense, adding that industries should change their paradigm on how defense projects are handled. North Korea has recognized 2 Russian-backed breakaway people's republics in eastern Ukraine as independent states. The move makes North Korea only the 3rd country after Russia and Syria to recognize the 2 breakaway entities, the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in the Donbas region. In a post on his Telegram channel, a DPR leader, Denis Pushilin, said he hoped for fruitful cooperation and increased trade with North Korea, an isolated but nuclear-armed state more than 4,000 miles away. The DPR's embassy in Moscow posted a photo on its Telegram channel of a ceremony in which North Korea's ambassador to Moscow, Shin Hong-chol, handed a certificate of recognition to DPR envoy Olga Makeyeva. North Korea's embassy in Moscow confirmed that it had recognized the independence of both entities, according to news agency reports. Ukraine immediately severed relations with Pyongyang over the move. The recognition was welcomed by some Donetsk residents living in the area. Let's talk now to Dennis Rever, researcher, Institute for Security Studies in Pretoria, South Africa. Nice to see you again, Dennis. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you for having me again.
So many people would look at this recognition of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic by North Korea as possibly a non-event diplomatically because of what has already been said. North Korea is already isolated, so it's one isolated territory recognizing another isolated territory. Is that correct?
It's an interesting dynamic, actually, and what's really interesting about it is that the way Russia approached the two regions, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, because for the past 8 years, since 2014, Russia was adamant that these two regions were actually part of Ukraine, and all the peace negotiations, the Minsk peace negotiations that were held between Russia and Ukraine, every time Russia insisted that these breakaway regions were part of Ukraine, and the conflict was an internal domain of Ukraine, internal political struggle. And you may recall that before the start of the war in February, one thing that changed was Russia made the claim that perhaps it is time for Russia to actually include Donetsk and Lugansk as part of its territory, the way they did in Crimea. So the recognition it's an interesting dynamic. It brings this interesting dynamic, whether Russia will try to maintain the position. Sooner or later, the peace talks will happen again between Ukraine and Russia, and whether Russia will maintain the position that Donetsk and Lugansk need to be reintegrated into Ukraine, and Ukraine needs to become a federal state as a way to freeze the conflict in the east, or whether we will see the two regions actually being integrated into Russia if Russia succeeds in defeating Ukrainian forces in Donetsk. So in that regard, that brings an interesting dynamic, an interesting point here. However, I don't think the recognition itself means a lot. North Korea is dependent on Russia for many things, and they work quite closely together on security issues as well. There were reports of North Korean camps being set up in Russia and being used, North Korean labor being used there. So they have a very close relationship with the regime in North Korea. So it's not really surprising that North Korea decided to proceed with the recognition.
Let's come to what some have already been describing as one piece of good news in a sea of gloom, if you like, and that is this progress that the UN Secretary General, the Ukrainian president, the Turkish defense minister, all the parties to the talks basically are describing as significant progress, and that is in lifting the Russian blockade of Ukrainian grain exports. Now, the devil, as my previous guest said, will be in the details and in the implementation. But are you surprised that the Turks have managed to pull this kind of progress out of this sea of gloom?
Well, I think two important factors here. Firstly, I think I would agree with the previous commentator. I had the privilege of hearing what he had to say. I'd agree that Turkey plays an important role, and they definitely see themselves as a regional power. And this is why, for instance, you saw recently with NATO membership for Sweden and Finland, Turkey did not just accept their membership. Turkey put forward the demands. Turkey sees itself as a power that can set demands forward and that can actually reach agreements and deals. So it sees itself as a very important regional power. So in that regard, it's not surprising that actually happened. However, it's also important to know that the talks, if we remember, the talks started earlier. The talks started about in the beginning of June, the first phase of the discussions about the grain. And at the time, one of the major problems was these discussions were that Ukraine wanted security guarantees. It wasn't a matter of whether Ukraine wants to export the grain. That was settled. However, Ukraine wanted to receive some sort of guarantees from Russia that if it goes ahead and demines the area around Odessa, that Russia will not use this as an opportunity to attack. And in my understanding, this remains a problem. So despite the fact that every party is very optimistic about the discussions and the peace negotiations in this regard, it's important to know that I think this issue remains very much in place. We've seen recently, yesterday in fact, Russia attempted to use an airstrike against the Snake Island, and Snake Island is an important strategic forepost for Ukraine, and it's one of the important factors that actually that actually allows the export of grain from Odessa. So it doesn't seem like Russia is willing to actually just allow Ukraine to export grains. And I don't think we're at the stage right now where this sort of negotiation can reach a productive conclusion. I don't know if it's possible at the moment. Yeah.
Given what you've just said, then let's use that to dovetail into the actual conflict itself, both on the ground and in terms of where each party is at. There continues to be some level of negotiation going on about possible resumption of peace talks at some point, with the so-called talks about talks. And when you then go on and look at that with what is happening on the ground, it does seem as if both sides are waiting, so to speak, for the decisive opportunity to strike one way or the other. Now, would this be equally a good moment, perhaps, for a country like Turkey, which seems to be surprisingly having good relations with both sides, to step up and possibly push the momentum towards some sort of at least truce pending talks? I don't know if, I mean, I'm not a diplomat, but I don't know if that's something that is feasible. Do you?
Well, I think we need to look at it with a number of factors in mind. First and foremost, you know, these kind of breaks, the operational pauses, are an inherent part of any military operation. So we may see them, we may see some sort of an agreement being reached, perhaps even this year. In fact, there were some rumors that this is one of the the conditions that Russia puts forward, that it will allow for the grain to be exported, given an operational pause or some sort of a truce being reached for the duration of this export. The fact of the matter is, if we look at the situation in the east and the south of Ukraine right now, Russia has reached its limit. It can potentially continue the offensive operation in the east. However, it's unlikely that it will achieve any quick victories, and it will once again be met with heavy resistance from Ukrainian side. In the south, however, it's questionable to what extent Russia can maintain and defend the positions that it has. And we've heard President Zelensky recently stating that it's time for a counteroffensive in the south. So right now, I would say that an operational pause is unfavorable for Ukraine and more favorable for Russia. So perhaps Russia would be in favor of that. We also need to remember, and I think the previous speaker did a good job mentioning it, is that the more time passes, the better the Ukrainian position becomes. Not only because it sort of alleviates some of the problems with replacing Russian gas, but also because currently Ukrainian troops are receiving training in the West. We know in the UK, for instance, and Ukraine is also receiving the equipment. So the longer this war continues, the better the Ukrainian position becomes. So I think Russia would favor a break in war right about now to replenish the troops and to retrain. They're facing some challenges domestically with getting people on board with the war. But I don't think Ukraine will benefit from such initiative right now. And I think they would try to avoid it. Avoid this kind of deal. But Turkey obviously has proven itself as a valued partner for both countries. And if an agreement will be reached, will be most likely reached in Istanbul.
Let's look at the last point you raised, which is the question of replenishment and the need for some level of sustainability in all of this. And let's take a look at those who have been supporting Ukraine. Under normal circumstances, the Ukrainians might have found it a lot more difficult to stand up to the Russians, except for the robust Western support that they have gotten so far. But within many of those Western powers, there is now internal political crisis, which is part of what I referenced with my last speaker. The UK is in the process of getting a new leader. France, the president was re-elected, but he lost control. His absolute majority in parliament. The Germans are settling in with a new chancellor who is still feeling his way around after Angela Merkel. The Italians are also having some level of political instability with the far right and far left, rather, still struggling. So in many of those places, they have internal problems that may make it difficult for them to continue with the sustained support that they have given for Ukraine. Do you think that should have President Zelensky worried? And if so, what do you see happening, especially since the Russians, as you pointed out, can fight for a pause, knowing fully well that when that pause is over, they'll probably be able to come back much more refreshed and faster than the Ukrainians, whose backers have all these problems?
It's a very valid point. It's a very concerning point, and a lot of people in Ukraine are concerned about these issues. However, I think one distinct factor is that we're talking about democracy. So a lot of these, well, all of these Western countries are democracies, and for a democracy, the bureaucratic mechanisms play a very big role. So for a country like, for instance, the UK, the change in leadership may have an impact on how much it's being discussed on a top level publicly. You know, Boris Johnson visited Kyiv, I think at least two times actually. However, the change of leadership would not necessarily have an impact on the foreign policy objectives. For instance, we know that in the US, the support of Ukraine has been approved on all political levels. So even if Biden is struggling, the support for Ukraine is still strong politically among the elites. So it's unlikely that this sort of change would have major impact on the supplies. And of course, the political support on the top level is also very important. And we've seen, for instance, some resistance from somebody like President Scholz from Germany, who has been very cautious about the way he discusses issues and the way he speaks, and yet still we see the support actually growing year by year, to the point that in the beginning of the war, people were very, very skeptical about providing Ukraine with weapons or just providing Ukraine with Soviet-made old weapons. Today, we're discussing providing Ukraine with modern weapons, and even there are some talks now of, for instance, providing Ukraine with modern Western-made jets and a Western-made airplane. So in that regard, I see these things being developed, and it's very difficult to change the course politically, even if the leadership changes. I don't think it will have a long-lasting impact on the support of Ukraine.
Finally, going forward, perhaps let's look at the situation within Russia itself, which you referenced in the answer to your last but one question, which talks about support for the war within Russia itself. Many of the reports we have, although admittedly those reports are from Western media, do suggest that the support for the war in Ukraine was at best lukewarm, and now there are quite a number of people who are dead set against it because of its economic impact within the country. How concerning would that be for President Putin, especially because he also relies on conscription to keep his army supplied with troops? So if the populace is not in support, that might make it more difficult, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a very nuanced issue. So on the one hand, I would disagree that the support for the war is lukewarm. I would say the support for the war is actually there. In fact, Putin, although often described as an authoritarian leader, often tries to act in a way that the public supports. So we often see that Russia changes its course if it doesn't have the public support, and actually backtracks on its previous decisions when it doesn't suit their agenda. So the political support is there for the war itself, the way it is being framed on the media, and we know that the media is heavily controlled by the state in Russia. However, there is no support to fight in the war, and that's a slightly different issue. Legally, there is no way for Russia to force people to join the war, if I can frame it this way. So, for instance, recently there was news about 500 recent conscripts who declined to join the war, and they simply they stopped the buses. They were transported by the buses. They stopped the buses and they actually escaped. And there is legally nothing that Russia can do to force people to go to Ukraine, and that has to do with the legal system in Russia and the fact that the martial law has not been imposed, and the fact that formally Russia is not in war. And hence, people are waking up to this issue that they can actually avoid fighting in Ukraine, and if they're being forcefully sent there, they can actually take legal action against it, which is quite interesting. Which is also part of the reason why we see news coming from Russia that the Wagner Group is now looking for conscripts in prisons, and promises are being made for early releases, and it shows the fact that Russia is seriously struggling with getting the people on board and getting people to join the military to go fight in Ukraine, and that's a major issue, of course. Now, add to this a lack of public support. When that happens, and it will eventually happen, that will become a major problem for Putin. What we see in Russia right now is that people are conscious of rising prices. However, they don't quite understand why the prices are rising. I know it sounds bizarre, but in their mind, the war and the price hikes are not connected. Now, when the situation deteriorates further, and it will, the war will become less popular, and this is where we'll see perhaps a drastic change in policy from Russia, because, as I said, despite everything that is being said about Putin, Putin is quite conscious about his public image, and that's where perhaps we will see Russia seeking a quicker diplomatic solution, and perhaps finding a way out from Ukraine.
Indeed, Dennis River, thank you so much for your perspective and time. Do continue to stay safe. See you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
After the break, International Skating Union moves skating Grand Prix from Russia to Finland. Join us again. Thanks for staying tuned. Welcome back. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says that it was a very difficult decision to grant an exemption from sanctions imposed on Russia for the return of a repaired turbine needed for the Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline. The sanctions are aimed at Russian President Vladimir Putin and his enablers and aren't designed to harm our allies and their populations. He added that Ottawa will continue to unequivocally stand with Ukraine.
So this was a very difficult decision. But we have seen Russia consistently trying to weaponize energy as a way of creating division amongst the allies, of undermining the general population's support for this essential effort in Ukraine that governments continue to support. And I remind people that the sanctions that Canada's leading on, that we continue to push harder and harder, are aimed at Putin and his enablers, and aren't designed to harm our allies and their populations. This decision to be there to support Germany and Europe in the real challenges they face around energy, particularly over the coming year, as they work as fast as they can to get off their reliance of Russian oil and gas, is an essential piece in ensuring that not just governments across Europe and around the world, but populations in our countries continue to support their governments stepping up with billions of dollars of support in military and financial and humanitarian support for the Ukrainian people while they lead this essential fight against tyranny and oppression. Canada has been one of the strongest countries in the world in standing with Ukraine, in being there to support President Zelensky and the heroic fighting that people in Ukraine are doing, not just to defend their homeland against an illegal, unjustifiable horrific invasion by Russia.
Let's talk to Idi John Bekwa of our business desk. Idi, morning. Let's kick it off from there where Prime Minister Trudeau just ended. Electricity prices are going up in Sweden.
Yes.
As Russian gas pipelines, which we talked about earlier this week, go offline.
Yes.
What's the link?
Yes, so that turbine, which is what Canada is explaining, you remember that Ukraine is not happy that they returned the turbine. But I mean, this is what connects or gives gas to Germany and some other Eastern countries. One of those countries is Sweden. So while Germany is filling it, Sweden is also filling it. At the beginning of the war, when there were threats and talks, I remember particularly in March, Sweden had come to say because they get less than 5% of gas for electricity from Russia, that, oh, they are not going to be bothered, it's not going to disturb them and stuff like that. But months down the line, it's not really like that. Electricity price is now at a 3-month high because, okay, fine, Sweden depends mostly on hydro, on nuclear, on wind, and then, of course, they have the gas, and coal. Also, they have a bit of it from coal. But the truth is, when something happens in one area, it also affects...
It tends to go round.
Exactly. Because, first of all, at this time, water levels are low. So electricity from hydro has reduced. Now, they don't have the gas, which is minimal that they get from Russia, because... Remember, even when Canada has returned it, there's maintenance going on.
Yes, it's part of a maintenance process.
It's part of the maintenance process. Now, Germany has increased its coal plants production.
But Sweden doesn't quite have those options.
No, they do have the option, but coal is now more expensive in Europe.
Oh.
So you see, it now fits into the electricity. Coal is now more expensive, water levels are low, so that means their production through hydro has been greatly reduced. They don't have the alternative of gas from Russia because there's maintenance going on. So the little supply, of course, demand is struggling to get it. So, so prices have gone up, and they say it's at a 3-month high at this time.
Leaving the energy thing, although I'm fairly certain from everything I've heard from you that this is related.
Everything is connected.
The latest data from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics says the inflation rate is again, I think these records keep being broken every month.
Every year. So 40 year today, next month
is down.
The inflation came out 1.3% higher than the previous
month, at 9.1.
Yes. Analysts had expected that it would at least go to about 8.8%. They didn't really see it going as much as 9, not to mention more than 9.1. And, we talked about what the Fed did, which made the dollar more valuable than euro. At some point yesterday, there were reports that even the euro was lower than the dollar, but that hasn't stayed because it's really sensitive, always moving. But this now is making analysts say that the Fed might once again just go the other way. And last time they did 75 basis points increase in the Fed's rate. This time it might go as much as 1%.
Yeah, because
that's 100
almost like
points.
A panic, almost like a drastic reaction.
Yes,
if you like.
and this will mean a lot to a whole lot of people, including Nigeria. This will affect our inflation because, Nigerians, we do a lot of imports. We import a lot of this. Because what it means is that things are more expensive in the United States. Things are more expensive in dollar. So we will import that into our economy, and that, of course, will increase our own price, inflation and cost of living.
Because
everything.
The prices will go up here too.
Then, on the other hand, servicing our debts becomes even more expensive. So already we're talking, we're doing 98% of our revenue. So you can just imagine what this will do.
It's a shock. I don't want to imagine what this will do, just not yet. And U.S. diplomats, even though the monetary authorities are fighting that, the diplomats are asking Japan to pull through with its digital asset sanctions on Russia.
Yes, you know that Russia, I mean, this is kind of funny for Russia because Russia as a government is trying to use the digital currency and digital space to transact, to scale through the sanctions, but they are discouraging individuals from trading cryptocurrency or dealing in any of those digital stuff. But of course, it's not really working. A lot of Russians are still engaged in it. So what the U.S. is trying to do is to reach out to Japan, because in Japan you have the miners of these cryptocurrencies, and so they are like at the back end of it, so they're able to control the data. So the U.S. is trying, to go through Japan to see if they can sanction and stop all this transaction. But as you said, it's not really easy because this is not centralized.
It is not.
It's not central bank.
That is the whole idea behind it anyway.
Freedom.
That's it, that nobody can actually control it. So you're trying to get some sanction. And I think the Japanese understand that, which is why they haven't quite moved on it, and they're getting the push.
Yeah, and Japanese also, they have miners, but if they continue to mine and they don't have transactions, they don't have trade, it's also going to affect them.
So of course.
I'm sure they have a lot of things to think about.
Yes, more than that, possibly more than that. Ini, thank you. Thank you so much for the explanation. There'll be more of that, as we always tell you, right after this show on Business Morning, and then later on, Ini and Ladia here, along with the rest of the team on Business Incorporated. So do watch out for that. Let's take a look at some of the sports. The trial in Russia of U.S. basketball player Brittany Griner is due to continue today as she faces drug charges that could see her sentenced to 10 years in jail in a case that highlights the already fraught relations between Moscow and Washington. Griner, a star player with the U.S.-based Women's National Basketball Association, the WNBA, was detained at Moscow airport on February the 17th, just a few days before Russia invaded Ukraine, unleashing a broader confrontation with the West. She pleaded guilty to a drugs charge in court on July the 7th, but denied she had intentionally broken the law. Her trial formally began on July the 1st at a court on the outskirts of Moscow. Russian authorities said the 31-year-old was carrying vape cartridges containing hashish oil, a substance illegal in the country. She was charged with smuggling a large quantity of drugs, an offense that could carry up to 10 years in jail. U.S. officials and a score of athletes have called for her release, and they say she has been wrongfully detained and should be immediately returned to her family in the United States. And the International Skating Union has moved the 2022-2023 Figure Skating Grand Prix tournament from Russia to Finland. The new schedule stipulates that Finland's Espoo would host the championship between November the 25th and 27th. The International Skating Union also extended the suspension of Russian athletes from international competitions until further notice. That's where we wrap up the program this morning. Thanks for being with us. I'm Ladi Akiridoluale. There's an update within the world today at 5 o'clock. Do watch out for that. The show is back tomorrow morning. But for now, have a pleasant Thursday ahead. Good morning.